Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Biblio Files, a show from the Ann Arbor District Library in Michigan that's all about books. Each episode, we spend a few minutes answering one book-related question, and this time we're answering, what's a great book of poetry? I'm Christopher, and I'm joined as always by Amanda and Lucy, and we have a special guest, Emily. So, Lucy, what did you pick for us this time?
Well, what I picked is a newer book of poems. It is called I Hope This Finds You Well, Poems by Kate Baer. And the way I discovered this was actually, and I'm not doing two books, but this was her first book, which she wrote, came out in 2020, called What Kind of Woman? And it shot to the top of bestseller lists, I think, because a lot of it was about like domestic situations, being a mother, being a wife, um, body size and things like that. And so some people were like, this is light, and then there was this other side of it that's like, actually, this is very much a sphere that women have existed in for a long time. And there have been poems that men have written about all kinds of things. So that's sort of why she got attention. But some of the attention she got was pretty negative. And she got a lot of, you know, uh, not nice messages on Instagram, through her email comments. And so I hope This Finds You Well is a book of erasure poems. So what she did is she took the comment or the letter or whatever it is, and she erased it. It's sort of like blackout poetry, except that you're still redacting text, but you're erasing it completely. And so one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because I think it's a way that shows that poetry can be really, really accessible, and also that poetry can be useful. Like it's this tool in this book. She took this hateful stuff and she turned it into something, kind of beautiful and moving. And that's like seems really important at this time to think about how can you take all that bad stuff and instead of just engaging in that hateful conversation, turn it around into something else. And I also like it because I think it shows how many different varieties of poetry there can be. I love the idea of blackout poetry, and this is just a different way of doing that. But I think, again, it helps. Like, I think a lot of people approach poetry and think, oh, I can't do poetry. I don't know how to read it. I'm not. And I think that this shows you that this is something that's like, letters and Instagram posts, stuff is out there, and she's just changing it around. I think that it might seem like this is a revenge thing, like she's trying to get back at these people, but I think what she was intending to do instead is like taking something cruel and giving it back to the person who said it as something beautiful. And that's actually an act of kindness. And she did say, I read an interview with her, and she said that there were certainly pieces that she did not include, anything that was like transphobic or homophobic or racist. She in no way wanted to profit off of other people's terrible messages. So it's not about that at all. And so I just thought it was a really interesting way to make poetry accessible, a really interesting volume of poetry that is very much reflective of this time. And she is at home, she's a mother of three, and she has an English degree, but poetry always had to be put on the back burner for her. So I like seeing a way that she could, put that forth in a way that's not cryptic to a lot of people. So that is I Hope This Finds You Well by Kate Baer. Emily, what did you pick?
Well, I apologize because my copy of this book is covered with decorative paper, and I tried to take it off to show it to everybody. I was like, no, I can't take this off without ripping the paper, and I don't want to rip this paper because it's very beautiful.
It is.
But I will show you the title page. Oh, it's reversed. So it is Years, Months, and Days by Amanda Jernigan. So basically the cover looks like this, and we do have this in the collection, but this is my personal copy. So I found this on the new books shelf. I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago. I was just like, looking through new poetry, and I love little books, like lifelong love of little books. So if you have a little book, like I'm going to pull it off the shelf and take a look at it. And this is a really interesting. So Amanda Jernigan is a Canadian poet, and she did this like artist residency in this like near this historical Mennonite community. And so she and her fellow residents were kind of walking through a Mennonite cemetery. And on older gravestones, what you'll often see is the length of their life listed in years, months, and days. And I've seen this myself in some parts. So she kind of got the idea for doing these poems from that cemetery walk. And also there are these German Mennonite hymnals, and that, were translated into English. And what she kind of did was she kind of pulled the language from these hymnals, which is like very simple language. And she just kind of like reworked it into these little tiny poems. And most of them are like very short. They might be like a couple of lines. But I really like what you said, Lucy, about poetry being useful, because I really do think that poetry is so useful to have. And I think that what I really love about this collection is that the language is very simple. It's very unpretentious. And it can really be, you can really just apply it to your own life very easily. And they're so short, they're easy to memorize. And I think because they're from this hymnal language too, even though it's been translated from German into English, it has a nice rhythm to it. So it's really pleasing to say. It's, and I think it's probably one of those collections where it's like, either you will really like it or you'll be like, why does this exist? I don't understand. Like, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of middle ground there. So, but I found it on the shelf and I was really charmed by it. So I eventually just had to go out and get my own copy. So that's me. That's Years, Months, and Days by Amanda Jernigan. Okay, and Amanda, what about you?
I love, two things. One, I love that you just found it on the new bookshelf. I think that's a great way to pick up things you normally wouldn't find. Also, I also love little books. So I was glad you gave a shout out to little books. So the book I chose for today, actually, first I'll say that we talked a little bit about poetry being accessible. And if you think about poetry, you can look at it from a point of view of a writer or a poet, and also as the reader. And there's different ways. Poetry is so different. And you can pick up a book of poetry. None of them are the same. Yes, there are styles. There are people who have PhDs in poetry. There's advanced poetry. There's very simple poetry that can be understood. So I feel like poetry has like this negative connotation with it of like, oh, I can't read poetry. It's too hard. Or, oh, poetry's not for me. It's too magical and sing-songy. And it's not. There's no one straightforward definition with poetry. And the book I chose to discuss and read specifically for this made me think about those things even more. The book I chose is called Gates by Sahar Muradi. And I chose this book because it was on another one of our discussion groups, the Unerased Book Club discussion here on AADL. And I didn't get a chance to read it or join the discussion or listen to it, but I've had it checked out for like months. And I thought, oh, that'll be my poetry book. And I grabbed it and I was confused. I didn't know what I was reading. It's not completely accessible just to grab it and start reading and fully understanding it. So then I had to pause, think about poetry, what I was reading. So the book, the author was born in Afghanistan. She was raised in the US. And the title of it is Gates. And the poems don't have titles. They all have 2 brackets as their title. And the book is sort of, or the poems are sort of metaphors for different things that can be gates, like entrance points, exit points, barriers, thresholds, ways of getting into and out of things, be it a place or a situation or a feeling. So I really started, once I started reading and was not grasping exactly what I was reading, the words were beautiful. I loved the sentences, but I wasn't instantly knowing like where they were, what they were thinking, what they were feeling. So I had to kind of remove myself from how I previously read some collections of poetry specifically to look at more towards how this book was written and thinking about the gates are and more getting more the tone or the feeling versus like fully understanding. Like I don't know enough about Afghanistan or the history or the war to know how a person who was going through things there would have felt. And so I didn't have that relationship. But what this book does have at the end of it, there is a little section on notes that gives you some definitions of different some of the non-English words that were in here, some of the places, just to give a little bit of history or insight into some of those pieces. And I didn't read it till I only read the book once, and I read the notes when I was finished. And I didn't have the time to sit with the book and go through and piece the notes with the poems. And this is the kind of book that makes you want to do more work afterwards and challenge yourself to understand more of what the writer was going through or thinking or feeling as she was living these things in her life, like her father being ill, just the long journey she's had to take, and just understanding more of where she was coming from. So this is not a book for a poet, or I would say a poem novice. There could be, but I wouldn't. If you haven't read a book of poetry in a long time, I wouldn't grab this one as the first one. If you're up for a challenge, if you're up for reading a book in a voice or an experience that you haven't personally done, this is a really great book to do that with. It is a little book. It's a little chapbook. It's just beautiful writing. And I do want to investigate more about the author and her experiences to not understand what I read. You don't always have to understand the poetry you're reading. That's the thing, you really don't. And with this book, for me, it further enforced that, because you can enjoy the words on the page without fully grasping, like, oh, the author was here and she did that and she felt that. Poems aren't like that way. Some can be, but not all are. I used to read a lot of poetry in high school and college, which was many moons ago. And more of the poems that I'm reading lately are books that are written in verse. That's how I've been absorbing more poetry in the past 5 years or so, or 10 years. So this book was it was an interesting book. It was interesting to grab. I'm glad I read it, but I also wish I would have been able to read it I still have it checked out. I can, but I know that I'm not done reading or thinking about the book. And I know, Emily, you seem to have read this. Lucy, I know, read it for the discussion. So it's an interesting book. It's definitely different than both of the books we've talked about so far today. But that is my very long ramble about Gates by Sahar Muradi. And just know, going into it, if you do read it, just think about it. Pause with it and think about those gates and what the metaphors are in that. So that is my book. Christopher, round us out. What did you pick to talk about? What poetry grabbed you?
Well, first, I just want to say what you were saying about not necessarily having to understand the poems, I think is very true. I found that I didn't always know what the author's intention was, but that really didn't matter. I didn't need to know what the author's intent was or the circumstances around some of the poems I was reading. I just wanted to know what my circumstances were reading this poem and what it evoked in me. And I think that was a key when I was reading this book. But there are lots of different styles of poetry in this book. This is The Carrying by Ada Limon. A friend of mine turned me on to this book and her. So the book has a lot of different kinds of poems in it, as I said. Some of them are fairly straightforward conversations that she's having with someone. Some of them are memories that she has about her childhood or her mother. Many of them are very introspective. And that's another reason I love poetry. They're sometimes very lonely, very introspective in a way that I don't think fiction is. With fiction, you get a lot of people sometimes, but with poetry, you're often just in the author's head thinking about something. And I think they're often very lonely, and I really enjoy that about poetry. The book, as I said, is called The Carrying, and it is split into 3 different parts. There's a very loose theme of pregnancy in the book, and the author is pregnant, although I don't necessarily assume that all the things an author or a poet puts in a book are necessarily real, although in this case it seems too much of a stretch to imagine that she wasn't really carrying a baby in this book, because there are so many poems about it. It's split into 3 parts and it's called The Carrying. So there's a lot about pregnancy and ultimately about not having a child that's in this book. So it is full of different thoughts and feelings. There's a lot of reflections of nature too, which I really appreciated. So it was wonderful and beautiful, and that is The Carrying by Ada Limon. So we've got 4 wonderful books of poetry here, and as always, well, first let me ask if anyone has any other reflections on poetry. Okay. Well, as always, we would love to hear what you're reading with poetry or in general. And you can leave us a note in the link below at the Ann Arbor District Library website. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time, enjoy your reading.